In this video, I'll talk about 5 things I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour. Okay, number 1. When I first started, I didn't know that you could lift colour after the paint had dried. Knowing that amazed me when I found out. I knew you could lift colour on wet paper. I used to wait for the paper to begin to dry, and then I'd use my brush to sop up some of the paint to create a highlight. But I didn't know that you could do that on dry paper as well. And I remember feeling really excited when I found out about it. When I worked that out, I used a small flat bristle brush to lift highlights after the paint had dried. And then I was lifting highlights on dry paper, left, right and centre. And I overdid it a bit, I think. That little flat bristle brush worked fine for a while, but then it started to get a bit shaggy and it didn't work as well. Then I found these brushes. They're called silver scrubber brushes, and they do the same thing. Don't buy them though, because they're too stiff and they damage the surface of the paper if you're not careful. Which led me to these little brushes. These are fabulous for lifting paint after it is dried. They're called Eradicator brushes and they're from Rosemary & Co. They're little stubby flat brushes that are perfect for removing dried paint. They're stiff enough to get the paint off, but not so stiff that they will damage the paper. I wet them with water and I use them on dry paper. If there is anywhere where I've got a messy edge, these little guys will tidy that up. And they're good for creating highlights in painted areas as well. I put a link for these brushes in the description of the video. Only a few months ago, I'm ashamed to say, I found out that you can use wet sponges to lift off areas of dry paint to create highlights. Why have I not thought of this? I was reading this little book by David Bellamy, and here on page 22, he has a little painting that caught my attention. And he writes, "The background mountains were painted first and allowed to dry. Then a soft natural sponge was rubbed over the area where the shaft appears." I needed to try this, so I got my sponge and I wet it with some water. And then I ran the wet sponge over a dry wash. I had to keep wetting the sponge with the water. And again I thought, why have I never thought of doing this before? This opens up lots of possibilities. If I want to rub back some areas of a painting that are away from my focal point and make those areas less saturated in colour, this is the way to do that. Okay, the second thing I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour. It might be obvious to you, but it wasn't to me. I didn't know that you could stretch watercolour paper and keep it flat when you painted on it. My earliest paintings are all wavy and wonky, and I can tell you it was no fun painting on paper when it swells like that. Learning how to stretch the paper before I used it made such a difference. It took me a while to work out a method of stretching the paper where it never fails, but I got there in the end. I have a video here on YouTube where I demonstrate how I do it. You're probably thinking, why don't you use watercolour blocks, Louise? I've tried them and they don't work for me. I work too wet and the paper swells too much. I know you can buy really thick, heavy paper that doesn't need stretching, but I stretch this paper too because if I work on a large piece of it, it gets a bow in it. And I much prefer working on paper that remains flat. And if you've never painted on paper that remains flat, you should try it. The third thing I wish I knew when I first started painting has to do with composition. It became clearer to me when I was reading this book by Tony Couch called Watercolor You Can Do It. There are 7 elements of design: shape, size, line, direction, texture, colour and value. There are 7 principles of design: contrast, harmony, balance, repetition, dominance, gradation and unity. Of the principles of design, one of them is more important than the others, and that's dominance. And when I first started painting, I didn't realise that dominance was the most important design principle. So if you take that principle of dominance and apply it to the elements, then a successful painting should have a dominant shape, a dominant size, a dominant line, a dominant direction, etc. Now I know that, and when I look back at some of my earlier paintings, I can see where I went wrong. For example, it's important to make one size dominate in your painting. Here on this climbing rose, all the flowers are the same size. Nothing dominates, there's no variation. I think it would have been better if I had included more variation in the size of the roses. And I should have added a focal point where I put most of the contrast, instead of having the same tonal value all throughout the painting. The focal point should be where the darkest areas are, and the rest can fade away and be softer in value. I thought this was great when I first painted it, but now I know better, and I can see where I went wrong. Understanding how to compose a painting properly is a huge undertaking for a beginner, so don't beat yourself up about it. I'm still working it out. Baby steps. The fourth thing I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour was how to mix colours. I was an acrylic painter, and acrylic paint is creamy and easy to mix. If I wanted a colour to be lighter, I mixed some white with it. Watercolour, though, had me stumped. I used tube paints, and when I squeezed the paint out onto my palette, it went hard quickly. Then I had to use water to soften it. And when I softened it with water, I ended up diluting it too much, and I couldn't get the depth of colour that I wanted. There was also no white to mix with my colours to lighten them. It was all too much to work out. So instead of mixing, I tended to use colours straight out of the tube. I did very little mixing on my palette. I avoided it. Any mixing I did was on the paper when I worked wet on wet. Now I know better. Now I know how it's important to mix semi-neutral colours and include them in my paintings. Now I know that it's usually better to mix greens and violets. When I mix paint, I like to squirt out a bit of fresh paint. I find that easier than trying to mix with paint that is hardened on the palette. I look at some of my earlier paintings. I'll start with this one that I showed you earlier. The colours on this are so garish. They look artificial. They're way too bright. Same again on these tulips. The colours are way too bright, and I've really overworked the painting. I'll talk about that in a minute. And these ranunculus, again, the colour is too bright. There's no relief anywhere. If I was to paint these again today, I would mix my colours and I would tone them down quite a lot. I would also have a focal point, and I'd fade the colour away from the surrounding areas. I would definitely not use green out of the tube like I have here. I'd mix my own. While I thought they were beautiful when I first painted them, I can see now that they aren't. The fifth thing I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour was not to fuss with the paint. And this is important. I was an acrylic painter, and painting in acrylic involves lots of layers and lots of blending. Because acrylic paint is opaque, I could try different things, and if I made a mistake, I was able to cover it with more paint. Watercolour is a whole different beast. In the beginning, I fussed with the paint. I tried to make it do what I wanted it to do. Instead of leaving it alone and accepting what it gave me, I overworked things. I'm still guilty of that today. I try not to, but sometimes I can't help it. I know that the paintings I'm most happy with these days are those where I haven't fussed. I've put the paint on the paper and I've let it do what it wants to do. The kookaburra painting I painted recently and the guinea fowl are two paintings where I didn't fuss with the paint, and the paintings just flowed off my brush. They were a joy to paint. If you're a beginner, I want you to know this. The initial wash you apply to your paper is the most captivating, and that first wash showcases the true beauty of the paint. I tend to layer because I like detail. But more and more now, I'm going to try to limit the number of layers I use, because watercolour paint loses its freshness the more you fuss with it. And I guess that comes back to the importance of planning your watercolour painting before you begin to paint. I have a video about the importance of planning watercolour paintings as well. So there you have it. There are 5 things I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour. There are more, but they were the main 5 that I thought about when I first started planning this video. I'll share more things I wish I knew in future videos. Most of this knowledge has come about because I've made mistakes, and mistakes are how you learn. But if I can save you making a few of those mistakes, then I'm happy. If you are a seasoned painter, let me know in the comments some of the things you wish you knew when you first started painting in watercolour. One more thing, Dom has been busy adding lots of new prints to the shop, so check it out and tell your friends. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next week with another video. Quiet on set. What do you want me to do? Getting mixed messages here. In this video, I'm going to talk, should I say I'm gonna or I'm going to? I knew you could lift. Then I found these hairs in my eyes. I've already said it, so we don't need to say it again. It's all right. Here we go, back to face the camera now. That little flat bristle brush worked well. Yeah, why? Oh, I need a sea sponge.
Where?
Where? I don't know where to put it. Hang on. I don't know where it is. Here it is. Am I in the right spot?
Yeah.
Bellamy. I was reading, was that really awkward? Why have I not thought of this? The third thing I wish I knew when I first started, I did it again. Now, I did it again.
Just start from now on.
Stop doing it.
Do I start from now?
No, do it all again.